Over the last few weeks, I've seen a few people referencing this study, Obesity and Hiring Discrimination, published in Economics and Human Biology by Campos Vasquez and Gonzalez from the University of Mexico, just for the sake of being walking stereotypes, I assume. And one of the reasons that I want to look at this study is because I've seen a lot of people quoting the results of this study. And the results of this study are quite easy to misinterpret or misrepresent. Now, I don't necessarily blame the people talking about this study for that misrepresentation. After all, for the most part, they're quoting the researchers who wrote it. However, the conclusions that the researchers draw from this piece of research, while some of them are technically correct, which is of course the best kind of correct, there are some things that they neglect to mention, and it's those parts of the results that they neglect to mention which are far more interesting than what they've actually written down. So we will read through the abstract, look at some of the points of methodology of this paper, and then we'll talk about the results. So the abstract reads as follows. We implement a correspondence audit study that uses a non-paired design to test the effect of obesity on employment discrimination in Mexico. In Mexico, it is common practice to include a photograph in a resume, and job advertisements often specify personal and physical characteristics. We use both types of information to evaluate discrimination against the obese and identify its potential channels. We send two fictitious resumes, one of a woman and another of a man, one obese and one non-obese, in response to advertisements for job openings. The obese photograph is a digital manipulation of a picture of the same non-obese person. We send a total of 3,202 resumes in response to 1,696 job advertisements. There is clear evidence of discrimination against obese women, but not obese men. The callback rate for non-obese women is 29.1%. For obese women, it is 21.3%. The difference is statistically and economically significant. An obese woman would need to send 37% more resumes to obtain the same number of callbacks as a non-obese woman. We explore different channels that could explain this result, including customer discrimination, employer discrimination based on perception of customer expectations, productivity and salary, the gender of the person making the hiring decision, and the proportion of women in the occupation. We find no strong evidence in favor of any one channel. Advertisements with men identified as the contact person discriminate more than those with women, but replacing those men with women would reduce the observed gap in callback rate no more than 25%. Well, that all sounds very damning, doesn't it? But let's take a bit more of an in-depth look at the study and see what actually happened. So the methodology section is very much as you would expect from a study such as this one. They talk about how they formulated the CVs for each one of the jobs that they were applying to, changing about the relative levels of education and the relevant experience that each applicant had, and applying a variety of positive dummy variables to the letters and CVs that were sent, mentioning things about honesty, punctuality, willingness to travel, so on and so forth. Generally, phrases and words which are associated with making your CV look as positive as possible. And this is figure 1, which is the callback results. You know how people say a picture is worth 1,000 words? Well, this is a picture that's worth 1,000 words. So the callback rate for the non-obese woman was 29.1%. The callback rate for the obese woman was 21.3%. The callback rate for the non-obese man was 21.4%. And the callback rate for the obese man was 21.3%. This is the so-called discrimination that the obese woman has suffered. Now, a normal person looking at these results would say, well, you could frame that as discrimination against the obese woman, but what it also bears a striking similarity to is the obese woman being treated equally to a man regardless of his body type, which if you wanted to phrase it another way, could be described as the non-obese woman being given an advantage because of her body type, an advantage over obese women or men of any body type, a privilege, if you will. And this was the part which made me just want to talk about this study and how the people who wrote this study phrased the findings. Because we're going off the assumption here that the non-obese female with the advantage is the baseline ideal of what women should be receiving. And if you put that as the baseline of what women should be receiving, then relative to that, the obese woman is being disadvantaged. However, if you said that the obese woman was the norm, the baseline for what would be expected, then you could say that the non-obese woman is being advantaged or privileged over the obese woman. And men, well, they just get what they get, apparently. And there is a reason why I keep putting that word privilege in there. Because, of course, in modern society, we are constantly told that some people are privileged inherently over other people, and that narrative, that assertion of privilege, is almost always applied to men who are white and who are straight. And we're also often told that these people who have those traits, being male and white and straight, that they can never see that privilege because apparently privilege is invisible to people who have it. Which is, of course, hilarious because that implies that that privilege can never be quantified, it can never be measured, which of course means it can't be proved to exist. Now, under that paradigm of what is often termed privilege theory, which is privilege assertion, in order for that to be measurable, in a study such as this, you would expect the men to have an advantage over the women. And if you followed that up with the concept of normalized body types being given advantage over non-normalized body types, you would expect the non-obese man to get the biggest benefit, followed then by the obese man, and then probably by the non-obese woman, with the obese woman last in the pile. And yet, that is not what happens here. Instead, what we see is a non-obese woman being given the biggest advantage over all the other candidates, and in fact then all of the other candidates, the non-obese man, the obese man, and the obese woman, being treated basically the same. Now, while this was the first thing that I noticed about this study that was interesting, it was not, of course, the only thing that I noticed about this study that was interesting, especially in relation to wider societal narratives, things that we are told by people of the more feminist-minded persuasion. And we'll talk about that right about now. Another common cultural narrative is the conspiracy theory known as the patriarchy assertion, which is the assertion that throughout all of human history, men have oppressed women and that men have organized society to benefit themselves at women's expense. For example, feminist Shulamith Firestone believed that patriarchal ideologies support the oppression of women, and gives an example such as the joy of giving birth to children, which she labelled as a patriarchal myth designed to oppress women by keeping them in the home giving birth to children. This was followed up by another feminist, Alison Yeager, who said that patriarchy is the primary cause of women's oppression, and that the system of patriarchy accomplishes this by alienating women from their bodies. Other later feminists, such as Iris Young and Heidi Hartman, believed that patriarchy and capitalism interact together to oppress women, and as such delved quite heavily into Marxist class theory, applying it to gender relations. Feminist Gerda Lerner, in her 1986 book The Creation of Patriarchy, makes a series of arguments about the origins and reproductions of patriarchy as a system of oppression of women. And there is, of course, the good old writings of Bell Hooks, who believes that everyone and everything is patriarchy, and as such, pretty much everything works to oppress women to men's benefit. So this notion that men do everything that they can to hold women down while elevating other men is a very firm narrative in society. Now, why would I bring all of this up in talking about a study that's looking at so-called hiring discrimination? Well, when looking at the data of who was doing the calling back, that is, looking at the gender of the job offerer, well, we see some very interesting patterns in the data. First of all, when looking at the female photographs, both men and women called back the obese woman at about a rate of 22%. Females massively overfavored the non-obese candidate at 27.9%, and males also massively overfavored the non-obese female by 31.5%. In cases where the gender of the job offerer was not known, the callback rate for the obese woman was 18.5%, but callbacks for the non-obese woman also massively overfavored at 30%. So what is quite interesting is that both men and women favor the non-obese candidate, with men favoring the non-obese candidate slightly more than the women did. However, what is also very interesting about that is that the male hirers only made up about 23% of the total. Non-identified was 21%, and female made up the majority with 56%. So you look at things like this and you're still left to wonder, why are men giving this non-obese woman such a massive advantage if men are supposed to be oppressing women, if men are supposed to be doing everything in their power to systemically disadvantage women? To which I have no doubt the response would be something along the lines of, well, they're only giving a benefit to non-obese women, something something beauty myth something something. To which the question then has to be asked. Men do everything that they can to keep women down until what? An attractive woman walks into the room and suddenly they forget all about how much they want to oppress women and start giving them advantages? Worst patriarchy ever. In fact, findings such as the ones in this study fall far more into line with the observation that humans are a gynocentric species, that is, a species that would prefer to protect and provision for the female rather than the male. And this, of course, leads us to the most interesting part about the so-called discrimination that the obese woman is receiving, and that is that, according to the numbers which this study had, even if you replaced all of the men doing the callbacks with women, you would reduce the observed gap in callback by no more than 25%. And of course, part of the reason why that effect is so small is because of the massive overrepresentation of women in hiring. So, there you go, obesity and hiring discrimination. It's really interesting the data that they choose to highlight, and also really interesting how they choose to phrase it. Obese men, obese women, and normal weight men all treated the same, slim women being given an advantage, obviously discrimination against obese women.